One of the most confusing of Russia's tank storage bases is the 1311th. It's gone up and down again in number of tanks over the years. So for the next deep dive, we take a look at this one, located in a suburb of Yekaterinburg. And I was fortunate enough to get the highest possible resolution satellite image of the very day it was taken. Just 4 days old as of this video being released. So we took the satellite image along with every other source we could find to put together a full detailed look at the base. Which is a perfect segue to our sponsor, Ground News. Reading and getting your news just from one source often doesn't give you the full picture. Many outlets out there are biased, some purposefully to try to manipulate the narrative, others just unconsciously. So where Ground News is great is they gather related articles from thousands of sources around the world so you can compare how different outlets cover the same story. I only wish they did the same thing for satellite imagery. Every story comes with a clear breakdown of the political bias, factuality, ownership, and headlines of the reporting sources, with ratings backed by independent news monitoring organizations. For an example of this, take a look at this story about US long-range weapon use by Ukraine against Russia. For this same story, the right-leaning outlet portrays it as an escalation, while the left-leaning one literally says the exact opposite. You can see how if you only read one or the other, odds are you won't be getting the full story. Another great feature that I love is their blind spot feed. Here you can see stories that are either ignored or hardly covered by one side or the other. A real useful feature in my opinion. So go to ground.news/covertcabal or scan my QR code to subscribe today and you'll get 50% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. This is their best deal of the year and it'll only be available for a limited time. And if you're already a subscriber, you can send Ground News as a gift for 50% off too. So make sure you use my link. Again, Ground News. The first mention of this base comes from a 1964 CIA document. In it, it's referred to as the Severolovsk barracks. Now to me, when I hear barracks, I think of living quarters for troops, not vehicle storage. And it's interesting to see how most of these storage sites that we've done deep dives into just refer to them as barracks. Now, half of those actually were barracks as I think of them at the time. The other half, maybe the CIA was wrong, or they had bad data, after all it was the 60s and the early days of satellite imagery, or they have selectively declassified documents, or just call these bases that. But the 1311th was an original Soviet armored vehicle storage base, at least by the early 1980s. It'd be fascinating to see the documents that are referenced in the references here. The redacted photography section likely isn't all that interesting to me, as it would just be a list of satellites or even U-2 flights, along with their dates and mission number. But the mention of it being included in a US air target chart makes me only want to see it even more. You'd think after 60 years they'd declassify them, but I guess it makes sense not to. While the Soviet Union has collapsed, the US and CIA still exist. And honestly, every small detail of formatting, styling, capability, method of analysis, and so on can potentially give insight into intelligence and techniques. Something called the mosaic theory. Something Masal Dahlgren turned me onto here. And that makes sense. Basically any small piece of information that might seem harmless, when combined with many other small pieces, can actually reveal some vital information. Especially with AI today that can do the work that take hundreds or even thousands of man-hours, just in seconds. That being said, I'd still wish to see these. But from declassified satellite imagery, we have this one here from 1974 and this one from 1984. Both show the same large garages that are there today. But regardless of whether it was just barracks for troops or armored vehicle storage, it made a great location following the CFE treaty, which limited the number of tanks that were allowed in Europe. And by Europe, it meant west of the Ural mountain range. This 1311th in a suburb of Yekaterinburg is literally right on the very edge of the east side of the Urals. So it's a prime location that was already established to use to store armored vehicles. This base today is interesting as it's one of the few that are located in, or at least near, a major city, which makes getting information on it easier. Like this video here someone recorded from their apartment window a few years ago, showing when Russia demolished several storage garages. Also, another major help comes from Yandex, which is pretty much Russia's Google. In their maps, if you zoom into the base and click on the photos layer, they have this incredible 360-degree aerial image from 2 years ago. It's kind of surprising Russia allows this image to be posted like this, being how close it is to the base. Of course it's visible in satellite imagery, even on Yandex, but it's so much more detailed, revealing way more. Also, speaking of Google, they themselves have some good street view images that were captured just before the war began. Here we can see up close and personal views of the northwest section of the base. But this base, as I've said before, is a big mystery. The number jumps up and down like crazy, and here are those numbers. Pre-war, 355. A year later in 2022, it decreased by 71. The next year in 2023, it nearly doubled, gaining 243. And now finally this year, it's declined by 122. To get a better understanding of how, where, and why these numbers changed, we broke the base down into 4 sections. The garages, this southeast field, northwest section, seen easily on Google Street View, and then the main section in the north. And we used that to track how each changed over time. From this, that major jump from 2022 to 2023 almost certainly came from tanks that were parked inside of garages. Out of all the storage bases, this one unfortunately would have the widest margin of error just due to how much they utilize those garages. But those garages now are likely empty or near empty. Before the war, only one garage had visible tanks parked outside of it, and that's garage number 4 here. And still today, 20 of those are still outside of the original 34. But the huge increase of 243 tanks comes mostly from tanks appearing in the southeast field, as we call it. No tanks were here for years before the war, or in August 2022 or March 2023. Then suddenly, 80 appeared in October 2023. As you can see from the worn out path here, they would have come from the garage area. Also, another 30 additional are seen in the garage area from 2022 to 2023, and nearly 100 tanks appearing more in the main section here from August 2022 to October 2023. But all that is in the past now. In our latest 2024 image, taken just a few days before posting this video, it's dropped the most since the war began, from 527 to just 405. But unlike every other base that's seen a clear and steady decline, the 1311 changes up and down and makes it real hard to get a feel for its rate of decline. On one hand, it has 50 more tanks than it did before the war began, but on the other hand, it's obvious that it's almost certainly because those tanks were just hidden from view being parked in garages. If we assume that there's been virtually no additional vehicles added to the garages, and none or few left now, which seems most likely, here's how that graph would look. The max red area being if they were originally full pre-war, minimum being if the last year they removed everything from garages. If we extend those out to predict based on each, you can see that wide margin of error of how quickly it's declining. But based on visible tanks, being that this base is declining at the slowest rate of all storage bases, while others have virtually ran out, we'd expect to see an even more dramatic decline in the near future. As far as BMPs and other armored vehicles, there really aren't much. There's several dozen engineering vehicles, which often use tank hulls, so in lower resolution imagery, it can make distinguishing them real difficult. Then roughly a dozen BMP-2s mixed in. Again, they're virtually not worth tracking, as if we miss just one, or declines by just one, that ends up being a pretty big percentage that would give a false impression of some substantial change. So that's the 1311th. With this base down, that just leaves the 103rd, 1295th, and 2544th left to cover for our complete tank count. There are a few other smaller bases, like the 6018th, but they don't even have enough tanks left to bother making a video on. So for the next video, we might just group all 3 of those into one, and then we'll have a final full tank count. All with 30cm imagery, the highest available, giving us the most accurate count ever.